Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. On behalf of the Online Events Committee and the Young Scholars Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first Feminist Economics 101 and IFPRI's first online event of 2024. My name is Muzna Alvi. I'm a research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI as it's more commonly known, and I'm based at the South Asia office in New Delhi. And today I'm very excited to be hosting Professor Diane Elson. We are hoping that today's event brings together reflections from her rich career in economics and economic policy and provides a roadmap for future aspiring young feminist economic scholars. Before I introduce Professor Elson, let me tell you more about this series and the logistics for today, a couple of housekeeping rules. Today's event is part of an online event series on Feminist Economics 101. This series is a continuation of the series that we featured in our 2021 pre-conference, which was also organized by the Young Scholars Committee, and we are now in our fourth year. And so this is really exciting. IFPRI has greatly expanded its membership of young scholars in recent years. If you don't know, we have a dedicated Young Scholars Committee that I encourage several of you who consider yourself young scholars, early career scholars, to join. And we hope that this new season will create an important avenue to explore concepts, issues, frameworks within the feminist economics field, and the methodological differences from mainstream economics. And we hope to do that through conversations with experts in the field. And this is the first of the year. So each event will feature and features interviews of senior scholars by young or early career scholars. And we hope to have an interactive dialogue between young scholars and more senior scholars. So we hope that these conversations will inform and empower young scholars in the work that we all do. If you are interested in previous interviews, you can check them out on the IFPRI website. And we also have a YouTube channel where all of these are uploaded. I also strongly recommend staying tuned to IFPRI's social media and website for additional events, not just Feminist Economics 101, but we also have the Feminist Economics of Global Reproductive Justice event series and several fireside chats, several of which are also hosted by young scholars. So a bit about the logistics of today's event. The event will take about 1 hour and like I said, will be recorded and posted on YouTube. So if you miss part of it, you don't have to worry. You can go back and watch it on YouTube. For the next half an hour or so, I will pose questions to Professor Elson on her work and career and how it relates to feminist economics, followed by a conversation on feminist economics in general. But we also want to hear from you. So we aim to provide an interactive dialogue with Diane by including a Q&A session after the interview. In the meantime, if you do have any questions, you can feel free to put your questions in the chat. But we will also open the floor for questions to be asked live. So you can raise your hand when that happens. And we have two moderators lurking around who will help me moderate these questions. And lastly, this is a Zoom call, not a webinar, and we've kept it this way particularly to encourage people, sort of more two-way interaction. So a request and a reminder to please keep yourself muted throughout the event. And with no further delay, it is my honor to introduce today's senior scholar. Professor Diane Elson needs no introduction. In 2006, Routledge published a book on 50 key thinkers on development, and Diane was, of course, one of them. In her chapter on Diane's life and work, the author Sylvia Chant notes that no student of gender and development in any part of the world today completes a course at undergraduate or postgraduate level without some exposure to Elson. And I think I say that as someone who began her foray into feminist economics thinking at my master's level. Diane's work was one of the first that I read also. So Diane is currently an Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex, UK, and a former chair of the UK Women's Budget Group, an independent NGO set up by feminists in 1989. She chaired the Commission on Gender Equitable Economy set up by the Women's Budget Group in 2019. She's also former vice president of the IFPRI board, and she served as a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy from 2013 to 21 and has been an advisor to several UN agencies, including most recently UN Women and UNDP. She has published widely on gender equality, gender budgeting, economic policy, and human rights. And in 2006, she was awarded the Leontief Prize for Advancing Frontiers of Economic Thought by the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts. And in 2018, the Japan Society for Political Economy honored her with their International Book Prize. Like I said, Diane was one of the first feminist economics thinkers I read, and her work was a key part of what motivated me to work on gender budgeting for my master's, which was my first foray into feminist economics. And it's a path that I have pursued ever since in almost all of the research I have done. So I'm really looking forward to this. So welcome, Diane. And before we get started, I don't know if there's anything you would like to say.
I just want to thank you very much for this opportunity and to make contact with younger generations of scholars. That's always exciting to see that there is this renewal and expansion of feminist economics.
Thanks, Dan, and we're really excited to have you. So before we start, I wanted to ask sort of a broader overarching question that I like to ask, and this is the second time I'm doing this. But even in sort of my journey into economics over the last, 15 odd years now, so I'm really at the edge of what could be called a young scholar. But the thinking of what it means to be, what is economics, and the discipline itself has evolved quite rapidly, especially in the last 20 odd years, with this focus on more causality, quant type methods, RCT. What has what has your journey been like through economics as the discipline has evolved over the last few decades, and how has your own thinking on economics evolved over your career?
Well, I was a student in Oxford in the late 60s, and then economics was much more pluralist. It wasn't just neoclassical economics, but Keynesian, Marxian, structuralist development economics. We studied the work of economists from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Latin America. And they weren't all people who'd done their PhDs in the USA. They came from their own traditions of analysis of structures informed by historical understanding, and of course situated in the context of colonialism and imperialism. Feminist economics had not yet been created, but we were aware of gender equality issues, and I attended the first UK National Women's Liberation Conference in Oxford in 1969. Now, women's liberation is what we called it, and we were very inspired by the various movements and national liberation going on around the world at that time. One of my early books was an edited collection on value theory, Value, the Representation of Labor in Capitalism, which was published in 1979. And I find there's a whole generation of old Marxists who still think of this book, and who, if they meet me, want to engage in detailed conversation about my thinking on Marx's value theory. Economics, though, after this, economics from the mid-70s onwards came to be dominated by neoclassical economics, and policies switched from a focus on national planning for the public good to profit-led neoliberal economic policy. And it seemed more important to me to develop feminist critiques of neoclassical economics and neoliberal policies than to continue to work on Marxist theory and detailed excavation of Marxist texts. Fortunately, IFPRI was created and became an important network in which I could pursue this aim of the feminist critique of neoclassical economics and neoliberal policies. As you've mentioned, I was an associate editor of Feminist Economics for several years, from 1995, and vice president from 2004 to 2006. And this has been a great a growing and more international every year community, which I found very exciting and valuable to be part of. Now, the growing dominance of neoclassical economics meant my work was not appreciated in economics departments. And so I left the Department of Economics at the University of Manchester in 1998 to work for UNIFAM in New York for 2 years. UNIFAM, for those too young to know, was a precursor to UN Women. And I helped them develop their first report on the progress of the world's women. Then I returned to the UK after 2 years to a chair in sociology at the University of Essex, where there was a much more pluralist atmosphere. You could work on economic power, you could work on labor markets, and you could work, as I did, on human rights and economic policy. And after my retirement in 2011, I've continued to work on that topic with Radhika Balakrishnan and James Hines, two well-known IFPRI members, and also to provide advice to UN Women and UNDP on gender equality and economic policy. And as you mentioned, I've always been very active in the UK NGO called the Women's Budget Group, and I'll say a little bit more about what I've learned from that later. But I've also been, from 2012 to 2022, a visiting professor in Scotland at the Wise Research Centre for Economic Justice in Glasgow Caledonian University, where I've been able to teach on courses for trade union women and for Scottish government officials. And it's been very refreshing because the government of Scotland does have some progressive aims, whereas the government in London does not. And this really alerted me to the issue of how the kind of government that you have in power matters so much for how far you can put your critiques, take them into policy and get policy changed. So that might be something we want to come back to in the discussion.
Thanks, Diane. That's actually a good segue into my next question about, we all know, I mean, those of you who are familiar with your work, were one of the first economists to talk about and push for gender budgeting at various levels of governance globally. And I'm just curious what that process was like. Did you receive a lot of pushback? Were there some countries that were more accepting than others? And what do you think drives this resistance or acceptance towards more transparency in budgetary reporting?
First, let me say this big topic, and I'm not going to have time to go into a lot of detail. So I would recommend people particularly interested in this read the chapter that I wrote on gender budgeting in the Routledge Handbook of Feminist Economics, part of the IFPRI series. So there's a lot more detail in that. But the first thing I want to say is that gender budgeting means different things to different people and to different governments. What is understood as gender budgeting by the government of India and by the International Monetary Fund is much narrower than what is understood by gender budgeting by the government of, say, Andalusia in Spain, or by the UK Women's Budget Group. So you always have to ask, what type of gender budgeting are people referring to? What type of gender budgeting is a government adopting? Is it a potentially transformatory approach that looks at the whole budget cycle, not just the moment when the budget is presented in Parliament, but the planning of the budget, the implementation of the budget, and the auditing of the budget? Does it look at the tax as well as the expenditure? Because budgets have two sides. One is expenditure, but the other is tax. Does it look at the macro level as well as the micro or sectoral or micro level? Because if it doesn't look at the macro level, you've not got an approach that's going to enable you to put into question austerity policies. You won't be able to, the thing will be set up in a way that doesn't enable you to ask the question, what cuts is this government making and what impact are they having on women? So does it have the capacity to contest austerity policies? Because for me, that was always a key impetus in getting involved in thinking about gender and budgets. Or is it, as I think it is in too many cases now, a minimalist bean counting exercise undertaken in the context of reforms to public expenditure management, so it doesn't look at the tax side at all, and which tries to identify how much money is allocated to programs, quote, for women, and report this when the budget is presented to Parliament, which is very static, very small, because it's only ever a very small amount of money. And in any case, there's no general agreement on how you can decide what programs are allocating money for women. Is it ones that are just specifically targeted only to women and girls? Or is it ones that are broader than that? They include men and boys, but there's reason to think women and girls might be particularly benefiting from this program. There's no clear way of determining that. And if you look at the way this has been implemented in different countries, you get very different figures. for how much money they think they have allocated for women, because they define what this means in very, very different ways. India, I think, are fairly minimalist, but some countries like Nepal, like Indonesia, a much more expansive definition. So there are these different approaches to gender budgeting. It's important to bear that in mind. But I also, especially since I'm talking to a lot of young scholars, wanted to emphasize the progressive origins of gender budgeting, pioneered by a left-leaning federal government in Australia in 1984, and which was one of the inspirations for the Women's Budget Initiative set up in South Africa in 1994 as a cooperative venture between feminist researchers and ANC parliamentarians, some of whom have been to Australia and talked to the people who were involved in it there. And the aims of these pioneers were to ensure that budgets reduce gender inequality rather than increase it, and to follow the money throughout the budget cycle to reveal where power lies and how it needs to be contested. And it was this kind of approach that inspired the call in the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action for governments to integrate a gender perspective in budgetary decisions. I think the Beijing Platform for Action had in mind something much deeper and more transformative, with more potential for transformation than simply saying we want governments to report when they present the budget what tiny percentage of their expenditure they've allocated, quote, for women. Now, I was fortunate to work with Rhonda Sharp in Australia and Debbie Budlander in South Africa, as well as members of the UK Women's Budget Group like Sue Himmelweiss, who'd be known to many of you in IFPRI. And drawing upon all this work, I published in 1998 an article which identified a range of quantitative and qualitative tools that could be used to conduct gender analysis of the budget from a macro, meso, and micro level, and in ways that would enable you to contest austerity policies and to show how more gender equal budgets can be designed and implemented. It goes far beyond this notion of what's a small amount we're going to put in for micro credit for women or dormitory for women students. Now, I look back and I think you win some, you lose some, and some you win and lose at the same time, because since these progressive beginnings, the idea of gender budgeting has spread internationally with international organizations like UN Women, UNDP, OECD, and latterly the IMF playing a big role. And an IMF assessment in 2016 found that some 80 countries had engaged with some variant of gender budgeting, although they thought that only 23 had any really substantive engagement. But as this idea spread, it was frequently narrowed down to simply to be about some idea of transparency in budget reporting and expenditure reporting, but not about transforming the whole budget cycle with scope for challenging budgets at all their stages and not just reporting on budgets once a year. The governments which initiated gender budgeting in Australia and South Africa were progressive governments which had a real commitment to equality at that time. But if that commitment waned, as it did in both cases, or indeed a progressive government was replaced by a less progressive government in an election, then gender budgeting became more limited. And I think today we have many governments that pay lip service to gender equality, and they simply adopt some minimalist form of gender budgeting. And I've come to the conclusion that the single most important determinant of whether a government adopts a transformatory approach to gender budgeting is the whole political complexion of the government. If they have a real commitment to women's rights and gender equality, if they're doing a whole range of progressive things, then they're much more likely to be responsive to a transformatory approach to gender budgeting. So as I say, I think, you win some, you lose some. It's a bit like we are arguing that gender equality is important for the macroeconomy, and along comes the IMF now and says, oh yes, we agree. It is, but they interpret it in a completely different way with different policies and conclusions to ours. So I've come to the conclusion you have to be vigilant about seeming success as well as a complete blank wall pushback.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think these conversations are now even more important as we think about, what does it mean to gender, the loss and damage fund, for example, in the
Yes,
context of
yes,
climate change.
yes.
What does it mean to have allocations that target women or other disadvantaged groups? These conversations, I think, are something that we need to have at a sort of more global scale, not just at the national scale. It's something that we've been working with also that we struggle with. And, how do you get countries to commit to funding for gender and then following through. But that leads me to your question, and I think you alluded to some of this, but what does the future of gender budgeting look like, or what would you like it to be? Right, we of course agree that it's time to move beyond gender budgeting as a reporting or procedural task that governments do once a year and then they move on from. And as I was researching for this conversation, I was actually quite disappointed to see that the Indian government still follows the same sort of template and method that they have done for several years. There hasn't, been any improvement. And so what might a more transformative approach look like? And one example I think of is, for example, doing some sort of process evaluation that sees how gender responsive policies are translated to actual action on the ground. And of course, this is not going to be easy. It involves looking at administrative data on how many beneficiaries are actually women rather than just expenditures. So how do we get policymakers to operationalize something that is obviously complex, right? And what does the future look like for gender budgeting?
I think the first thing is to tell them there are tools already developed that they can use. It's not about reinventing the wheel. Right back in 1998, when I put together this collection of tools that I could see being used in the pioneers, they cover the kinds of things that you've mentioned, looking and seeing, okay, this money's been allocated, but how does that work out on the ground? How does it actually benefit or fail to benefit people? Challenging the idea that just because most of it goes to women, this is going to be very transformative. I remember Nirmala Banerjee doing a very good report on some projects in India, which like 90% of the funding went to women. But this is because they were very poor projects and men had other opportunities and didn't want to spend all their time for very little return working on these projects, whereas women had so little opportunity that they would accept the lower returns on these projects. But I mean, the response to analysis like that is not, this is a great project, look, 90% of the beneficiaries are women. It's rather that when we see why 90% of the beneficiaries are women, we see that the project needs to be redesigned so that it offers better opportunities to women. And so we should never think of gender equality in some kind of 50-50 way. 50% of the beneficiaries have to be men, 50% of the beneficiaries have to be women. It all depends what the project is, what policies, what the program is, what the needs are, what the needs of the different men and women are. So I think the suggestions you made of things that should be done are really good suggestions. And some of them, I mean, the tools are already there, and in some places they are trying to use them. There's a paper that was in Feminist Economics in 2013 that I co-authored with Rhonda Sharp, Monica Costa, and Siobhan Austin, which was based on research conducted at the invitation of the Women's Ministry in Timor-Leste, that showed how this much broader range of tools could be used in relation to the Timor-Leste budget. So we looked and see, they wanted us to particularly focus on education. So we looked at the education budget. We looked at the take-up, of course, of school places by women and girls. We looked at girls and boys, and we looked at the share of expenditure on education that went to girls and boys, but disaggregating by age group and by whether they were rural or urban. And it was perhaps not surprising to find that it was the rural girls at secondary school who were most missing out, whose share of the educational expenditure was considerably low, their share of that population of rural girls. But then, of course, that's not enough to do that. You've got to say, why is this the case? It's not because the schools are putting up notices saying no girls admitted. It's because of the other issues that are barriers to girls taking up those places. So some research on that. And then thinking, well, are some of these barriers things you could reduce by spending money in a different way? Or whether roads, proper toilet facilities, women teachers, scholarships for girls in poor families. So there are a range of, you can't just throw your hands up in horror and say, well, but it's not our fault, we built the schools and they didn't come. You can also go on to think about the ways by spending money in a different way and more money, you could ensure that girls did go to school. So we thought quite a lot in that article about the politics of this as well. How do you discuss with the different officials? Where are the resistances? I mean, one resistance was that the Ministry of Education believed their administrative data, but they did not believe data from household surveys. Whereas, of course, there's always holes in administrative data on enrollment in schools, and you also need to cross-check with data from household surveys. But that was one lesson as well about what kinds of data found credible by different groups of officials and politicians. But I think in that study, we did try and look in more detail at the kinds of issues that you raised for one particular sector, education. So it was a kind of meso level study that we did there, but going well beyond the budget to look and see what does this mean for people who are benefiting or not benefiting from this budget, and how can we change the way that we spend money in order to ensure that rural girls at secondary school age really are getting the same benefits as the boys.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I think, I mean, I hasn't time to go through lots of examples, but I think you made very good suggestions, and some governments already do some of the things that you've suggested. But too many are being steered by, especially by the IMF, to introduce only these minimalist forms of gender budgeting, which they sell to governments as being part of the program of efficient reform of public expenditure management. And so that just closes off so many avenues, so many tools. It just focuses in a very, very narrow accounting framework, and is not at all transformative. So I do hope that IFPRI members around the world can find out if the IMF, if IMF is doing lots of training of governments in the global south, particularly in Africa, I think, and but also in Asia. And it would be good for IFPRI members to ask questions about this and to challenge the kinds of approach and technique to gender budgeting that is being propagated in this way, and argue instead for all this broader range of tools that really enables us to see something about the impact of spending or not spending, because not spending is often just as important as spending. A gender budgeting tool that was there right from the beginning, very much used in South Africa, was, are they allocating enough money to implement this new policy or this new law that they brought in? I remember in South Africa, there was a very good new domestic violence law, but was there a funding to implement it? And the researchers and NGO looked in detail at what would you need to actually implement this law: training for the police, for the judges, for the medical staff, awareness raising for women so they knew what their rights were and where they could complain, and community education and action. And you needed really all these to come together. There's actually, the law is going to be implemented and make a difference. And of course they found, well, no, nobody had actually thought about that. It's not enough to pass a new law, but you've got to attach the money to it. And this, of course, in a context where there was a progressive government, they did have a genuine commitment to reducing domestic violence. But that was a good lesson in how linking the progressive new law with the budget allocation is really important to make sure it wasn't underfunded, that you didn't have a good new law, but no funding to really implement it. And I'd like to see more of that done, even if, of course, ideally we look at the whole budget, change the picture, challenge the macroeconomic decisions about the expenditure envelope. But there's also smaller things we can do. And I think challenging the adequacy of funding for particular things is also an important and more limited, but could potentially transformatory thing we could do.
Yeah, I think I agree. And it's also in some ways, sort of a first order problem where there's zero allocation. There is some merit to actually looking at budgets and seeing, is there any allocation at all, or is there sufficient allocation? Of course, we don't want to be stuck there. We want to move beyond those conversations as well. But in some cases, there's a binding constraint of there just not being enough money
because
in the
by
first
doing
place.
that, you then identify all the actions that have actually got to be taken to implement this, the kind of training, the kind of publicity, the kind of changes to procedures that have got to be done in order to implement this law. So I think lots of governments, it's easier to pass good legislation than it is to implement good legislation. I think this was one of the impetuses behind the inclusion in the Beijing Platform for Action of a reference to looking at scrutinizing budgets.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd like to take a step back, I think, from gender budgeting and talk about, you kind of alluded to this when you were talking about your career and how your own thinking has evolved. I wanted to maybe also narrow down on how, in your understanding and your experience, feminist economics has evolved over the last 10 or 20 years. And where do you see it going, and where would you want it to go if you think that those are divergent paths?
Again, this is my particular view from my vantage point, and others may have different views. So I think it's been very exciting to see the expansion of IFPRI, the expansion of feminist economics, the unprecedented numbers of people now coming to the annual conferences, the success in professional terms of feminist economics as a journal. I mean, that's all be the expansion of IFPRI staff, the fact that we now have this kind of online events. I think this is all excellent and very exciting. I sometimes worry that we still get a bit too confined by the professional pressures of what's required to get tenure in economics departments in so many places in the world, which is going to be a greater validation of quantitative analysis than qualitative analysis, or a neglect of mixed methods. I think it's always useful to triangulate between qualitative methods based on small-scale surveys and quantitative methods based on large-scale surveys, essentially. And I think there's a danger that we can get perhaps just a little bit too narrowed in terms of what's counted as a good contribution to feminist economics. So I hope that we're going to continue to be pluralist within feminist economics and recognize the range of different methodologies, the range of different knowledges that people want to draw on, and that we don't have all articles in feminist economics, say, being of this rather standard here's a problem, here's some quantitative analysis, here's the findings. I'm not against that because I think there's very, very valuable things there. And I've drawn a lot upon that kind of research, although it's not the kind of research I've done myself. I think there's also need to leave scope for more of the conceptual querying of what kinds of models is it that neoliberal economic policy relies on. Why do governments think they've got to have fiscal rules? What are the gender implications of these fiscal rules? Why are central banks think the only way they can tackle supply side driven inflation is to raise interest rates, which in many cases simply exacerbates the price rises. So I think we need also to have scope for this conceptual interrogating of the kind of thinking and models that underpin the mainstream policy, what the mainstream policies are. But I also think it is important as well to work with civil society in keeping alive that notion of alternatives and contestations, because although you may say in the UK at the moment, for several years now, the way at the national level has been blocked by a government which has presided over an increase in inequality and poverty of all kinds, that has not been interested in having a dialogue with the UK Women's Budget Group in a way that we did with its predecessors in the late 90s, when there was a Labour government, where we would regularly go for seminars in the Ministry of Finance, and we would talk to officials and politicians, and sometimes we had a bit of an impact on the detail of what the policies were going to be. That's a closed door. So what do? Okay, that door is closed. We're not going to be invited to the Ministry of Finance. But there are parliamentarians who are interested in a critique, not only parliamentarians from opposition parties, but there are cross-party parliamentary committees that are interested in analysis that will help them to ask ministers smart questions when the ministers go to report to them. So we've done quite a lot of work sending reports to these parliamentary committees, being invited to give evidence to these parliamentary committees. And I think that's put down some markers and had a bit of effect. And also the media, TV, radio, journalism, that's also been important. But then also working at grassroots level with local women's groups on one of the things we're doing at the moment is on how do you, supposing you want to know what is the gender wage gap in my city, how do you find out? Where do you get the data? How do you do the calculations? Or if you want to know what are the poverty of single mothers like in my region, how do you get the data on that? How do you make the calculations? How do you then use that with your local politicians and media? So we're doing quite a bit of work on that, which is really how do you equip women to be able to access data and to do some not econometrics. I mean, we're talking about basic descriptive statistics, but that can pack a political punch and can enable them as they lobby their local politicians and media, and also build their self-confidence that they know how to handle this stuff. So doing that, but then also working with our partner organisations, women's budget groups in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, particularly in Scotland and Wales, where their regional governments are much more progressive than the one in London. So you see more scope for talking, for instance, about well-being. How can we orient budgets towards not just economic growth or closing gender wage gaps, but to broader issues of well-being. So we should never feel disheartened because the government that we're trying to influence is turning its back on us, because there are usually other ways. I think in a particular country, the different tiers of governments, I'm thinking India, where some of the state governments are more progressive and have had more interesting work that's been done on gender budgeting in terms of the thinking about their plan and the way they're allocating resources in their plan. So I think there are these creative ways we can try and engage, even if the main door is closed. It will hopefully not be closed forever.
Yeah, change is the only constant. So I'm glad that you have this message of hope for young scholars who are working on gender budgeting or sort of gender sensitive economic policy. Diane, I want to put myself on the spot, and I was wondering if you have any questions for me or young scholars in general. And I'll try to be brief because I already see a lot of people have asked questions, so I'm sure the audience is eager to ask questions as well.
Right. So I was wondering how you came to join IFPRI, become involved in feminist economics.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, I was fortunate for my master's I didn't do a conventional economics program. I did actually a development studies program, which was and I was coming in from an undergrad program that was very quant heavy into a mixed methods type of environment, studying with classmates who had sociology training and engineering and urban planning. And so we had courses that spanned sort of all of these multiple disciplines. And that was really my first exposure to feminist economics thinking, to some of the work that you did, but also, feminist economics in India. And so people like Jayati Ghosh, who went on to be my MPhil advisor later on, and several others. And so I think that was really my first introduction to it. And I was hooked, and I thought that was it was an interesting avenue for me to answer questions that had been plaguing me as an undergrad. I'm from a minority community in India, and so there were a lot of these questions that I had about what could be done through my disciplinary training to address these questions. And I think feminist economics thinking provided an avenue to do that, right? Thinking not just beyond gender, but social inclusion quite broadly.
Yes.
And so I don't refer to myself as a feminist economics, but more economist, but more broadly, sort of someone who's interested in social inclusion. And those issues are really staring at you in the face when you're in India. And I think during my master's was the first time I was actually I was living away from home. I was interacting with classmates who also came from various different class backgrounds, which was not something I had exposure to, having been to very elite schools and elite colleges. I don't know, maybe even ashamed to say that, I had friends who you're kind of siloed in this bubble of privilege that you don't even realize that you are in until you step out of it and interact with people from outside. And so I think all of that really motivated the work that I did, and it's something that I continue to work on both for my MPhil, where I worked a lot on religion and gender and religion in the context of India, and then also for my PhD thesis. So that's been for my training, and then that's something I've carried on to my work now at IFPRI, where we work a lot. We work on food policy and agriculture economics, and you cannot talk about agriculture in anywhere in the world, but particularly in South Asia where I work, without looking at issues of gender and social inclusion. I mean, caste is such an important part of the way the rural labor markets are segregated in India. Who does what? Who gets paid what for the work that they do? And so, I was talking about process evaluation, and that's one thing we've been trying to do. Is we look at schemes and we say, okay, well, this is great. The government has this, 30% subsidies should go to women. But we've also been now going into the field and, talking to service providers on ground and saying, well, how many women actually come to you when they have to apply for a machine subsidy? What are some constraints that are preventing women from accessing, or women or even landless farmers from accessing these subsidies? And so these are just questions where we are trying to take fundamentals from gender budgeting, but actually apply them and say, okay, well, how is this translating to the ground? What are some procedural hurdles that prevent women and landless farmers from accessing schemes that are meant for them? This money is allocated. It's sometimes not spent year on year. It keeps accumulating. And the governments have, they're well-intentioned policies, but they just sort of fail on the ground because the system and the institutional setup just doesn't support or all or most subsidies require you to show some proof of ownership of land, which women don't have, landless farmers don't have. So all of those kind of things, and how we can shape or just even tweak policies very slightly to make sure that the intended beneficiaries are reached, is something we've been trying to do a lot more of in our work. And so I'm hoping that I'm continuing what I've learned from my academic training into my professional work now as well.
That sounds great, because I know about this 30% reservation of certain funds in India, which of course is quite specific to India. Nobody nowhere else has anything quite like that. And then you think all the questions you've been raising about what happens on the ground. Can women really access this? Does it transform their lives? So you have to look at the implementation and the audit as well. What are the outcomes in the end? And of course, that's a lot more challenging than simply looking at budgetary allocations. But that's what's needed. If even a policy was well-meaning in its way of allocating 30% for women is actually going to have any kind of impact on changing things for women. So I'm really excited to hear that you're looking at that. And I would say it's not only in India that there's this problem of money gets allocated, but there's all barriers to people taking it up. In lots of countries, they've got quite well-developed welfare states, but there's means testing of various kinds. The kind of barriers of people claiming what in fact they're entitled to, lack of knowledge, stigma. We've had a whole series of scandals about the rollout of policies that are supposed to enable lower income households to access subsidies for making their houses more energy efficient. And of course, it's made worse in the UK because they outsource all of this implementation to foreign companies, multinationals. And I think this is also, I didn't mention it before, one of the big challenges in many countries of looking at gender and budgets, that the public money is allocated, but it immediately goes into private hands because the actual provision of the services is outsourced to private for-profit institutions. And so you haven't just to look and see how much is being allocated, but who's making profit out of this? And couldn't we do a much better job if we didn't outsource it to these multinational companies, but actually kept it in-house as it used to be 30 years ago? And not as it is today, certainly in a country like the UK, where the actual public production of public services is much lower than the public expenditure on services. I think this is a new challenge for gender budgeting, try and get our heads around this issue of the outsourcing of public services.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. And I see sort of parallels even in sort of when we look at the Indian agriculture space, where so much of fertilizers and machines are all sort of being outsourced. Used to be in the hands of the government, and now, sort of private players are the major markers. And it creates a mismatch of incentives on both sides, for sure, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so there are several questions now for you, Diane, and I'm going to let Yazgi moderate, or Yazgi, do you want me to read out the questions in the order in which they were asked?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead, Muzna, if you know.
Okay. Yeah,
question.
Sure. So I'll start with, actually, maybe I'll call on, so Claudia, do you want to maybe unmute yourself? You had a couple of comments and a question.
Hi, sorry, I was not expecting to
Hi,
be called.
Claudie. Hi.
Hi, Miss Professor Elson. Really glad we've met a couple of times, and I like
Yes.
I like your work so much. I wanted to get your point on the challenge of implementing gender responsive budgeting, not just at the macro level, but also going to more like city level and more kind of regional level. I mean, that's something that we're trying to do in France quite a lot. And it seems to me that we may have a little bit more, I mean, I know it's not the same scale and the challenges are different and the impact possibly different as well. But I think it's a level that is potentially quite promising, and I wanted to have your view on that.
I agree, particularly when cities have got quite a bit of fiscal capacity and they can raise their own taxes. In the UK, that's one of our big constraints in doing more at city level or even at regional level, like Scotland and Wales, is these lower tiers of government have very little in the way of taxing capacity. So they're very much at the mercy of central government in terms of the total expenditure that they can undertake. So I think that's a constraint that needs to be worked on and overcome. But I know in most of Europe, in Western Europe, cities have a lot more fiscal capacity. And so I think that's a really, really promising area to work on. And it's probably in many other parts of the world. Big cities have more capacity, not just spend money, but to raise revenue to fund that expenditure. And so I'm very interested in the kind of work that you're doing, Claudia. And if you could put any references to it in the chat, I think people would benefit from that.
We'll try to do that. We currently working on writing something a bit bigger about it. I mean, so far we're mainly reporting to the cities.
Yes.
But we're thinking about doing the sharing in a more
that would be great. I think
way. Yeah.
Cities in Iceland, I mean, Reykjavik, I know, has also done very interesting work on gender budgeting. I visited there some years ago before COVID, so it's quite long ago now. But I do agree that the city and regional government level is definitely a place we can work on.
Thanks.
There's a question from Noor Almiani. Noor, if you're online, you can unmute and ask, please.
Hi there. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to be called either. I just it was very insightful, interesting to hear you talk, and I thought it was really insightful from somebody who doesn't come from an economics background, but rather an anthropology background. And on that, I was just kind of picking up on what you said about the quantitative versus qualitative approach, and I just kind of wondered. Briefly, you can maybe expand on that, and if you maybe see like the emphasis on quant level analysis to be reductive, and if you also see it as if you see kind of tensions between like broader feminist goals or I'm not sure analysis with quantitative or empirical approaches?
I think there are some tensions between feminist goals and the demands of academic life in a discipline like economics. And those we need to push back against if we can, but there are constraints there. I'm in favor of quantitative analysis, but I think it needs to be informed by qualitative analysis. So my PhD students, I also always encourage to triangulate, to do some of both, because your econometric study can't tell you about process. It tells you what went in and what came out, but it doesn't tell you anything, say, about the dynamics of communities or households that were responding to this external change and what those dynamics were and how far inequalities within communities and within households influence who benefits. So I'm a big fan of doing both quantitative and qualitative. And reading, we should read each other's work, so that I was brought up in a more interdisciplinary time, particularly in development economics, where of course you should read what the anthropologists and the economic historians are saying and be informed by that. And I think there's often been a narrowing down because of these professional deformations particularly from the demands in North American style academic systems for what you have to do to get tenure. I think we should try and resist those if we can, but we shouldn't say, quant bad, qual good, qual bad, quant good. I think we need a mixture of both.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Noor. I'm going to not put anyone on the spot. So there is a question from Ignacio, and I'll read that out. Diane, what for you does human rights analysis or activism bring to feminist economics, and where have you seen tensions arising?
Thank you, Ignacio. Great to meet you online again after several years of not seeing face to face. I from in my own experience on the framing, and I've done quite a bit of work framing gender analysis of budgets in terms of human rights, and more broadly economic policy in terms of human rights, as you know. What it does is it has just two things, I think. One is it helps us with the ethical framework. The ethical framework. So we aren't saying it's just about growth, or it's just about some kind of you can make some people better off, but some people worse off. But the ethical framework that human rights brings, I think, is really, really important, and is something that you do not get in, the utilitarian framework of neoclassical economics. We just seen what happens when you use that with what happened with the new government in New Zealand, which rolled back all the policies that were designed to reduce ill health through people smoking tobacco, on the grounds they needed the revenue that they would get from tobacco sales. And so they rolled back the policies to control smoking tobacco, despite the fact that this is going to result in excess deaths beyond what would have taken place if they'd kept the policies in place. I think this is just a classic example of what happens if you do not bring any kind of human rights perspective onto the economic policy. It's also, I found it useful in terms of institutions. So in the UK, of course, we have a government that is trying to, many parts of the government are wanting to withdraw the UK from the European Convention on Human Rights and to get rid of our own human rights legislation. But nevertheless, they haven't been able to do that yet. And we have an Economics and Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which can publish reports on the impact of austerity policies on people's economic and social rights in the UK. And they've done that quite a lot. And it's also informed, in some cases, the ability to bring some kind of legal case under a procedure called judicial review, for instance, which means there's another way of struggling. You have some other arenas for struggle against, say, austerity policies. We feminist and heterodox economists have been saying a long time, these are bad things, you don't have to do them, but it's good to have allies, to have progressive NGOs working on human rights, to progressive lawyers, and able to use the institutions of national human rights commissions, of reporting to the, and I know, Ignacio, you've been personally involved in some of the work on critiquing the way that countries report to committees like the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and enabling NGOs to put in counter reports which show what an adverse impact on people's economic and social rights these policies have been having. So I do think that's very important. It's not that we think human rights is, if we work with human rights and in that context, it's going to solve everything, because there's all kind of problems there that you have to contend with as well. But I have found it quite exciting to feel there was another. I always think of it as an arena of struggle where you can put your economic analysis in conjunction with the ethical framework of human rights and with the institutional framework, especially the international institutional framework for human rights. And if there's anything that's going to stop, we're now in the UK, we're in this situation where the government is wanting to introduce a terrible policy about sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. And it's the Rwandan government that's been saying, but you mustn't do this in a way that breaches international human rights norms. We won't cooperate with you on that. So it's interesting the way that it can be another sort of weapon in the armory. It can be another way that you can put your data, your analysis into quite a powerful set of movements and institutions that might do more than simply saying, well, look, we've done our analysis and this has a very gender unequal impact. To be able then to say, and this means you're in breach of your CEDAW obligations, and we're going to take this information to the CEDAW committee next time you report, I think gives you just an extra way of trying to bring about change. Hope to catch up with you, Ignacio, sometime soon.
Thank you so much, Diane. Hope to.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. I can't believe we are already at the top of the hour and there are several unanswered questions. So I hope that those of you who have questions for Diane can find ways to reach out to her or each other. I think there was a very interesting discussion on micro level gender budgeting and feminist cities. And I think that's a very good, there's some good examples and people have shared resources. So that's always very exciting to hear. So Diane, thank you so much for joining us. Those of you who are joining in online, you don't know, I just asked Diane a couple of weeks ago and she was gracious enough to give us a time so soon. And so I'm really grateful for that. And this has been an exciting session. And for me personally, it has sort of brought back memories from back when I first started doing this. And it's always good to be reminded of where you started and why you started doing what you did. So thank you, Diane. And thank you to all of you for joining. And thank you to the organizers for moderating the Q&A and the questions.
And thank you all the organizers and all the people who posted interesting things on the chat. I'm very excited about this whole range of city level initiatives. I look forward to learning more about them.
Yeah. All right. Goodbye, everyone. And
Goodbye.
Please watch out for the recording online.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.